Welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is a Helmholtz Award presentation by Terence Sanofsky. He will speak about NeuroAI in a moment. To motivate this topic a little bit, maybe you remember we have spoken about the performance and energy consumption of the brain and so on. But to put this in relation again, we have the human brain, which does amazing computation and can process quite a lot of information, but it requires only like 10 to the power of 6, a million times less energy than a supercomputer, which has maybe a similar order of magnitude of compute possible. So we are still quite apart in these two worlds, the real organic world on the one side with the organic brain and our simulation and engineering achievements on the other side. And the question of NeuroAI is how can these worlds learn from each other? And of course, the expert will speak in a moment. To introduce him, this area we are speaking about is computational neuroscience. And Terence was one of the pioneers of this area. And he was or is very famous for a very efficient and fast implementation of this ICA algorithm, where he has shown that it actually has some real-world implications. And nowadays, it's agreed commonly to be a standard processing techniques for brain analysis. He is member of the Royal Society and also won the Brain Prize. And very important for our society, he also won the Helmholtz Award in 2023. Before I hand over to you, Terence, you said something really nice, and I want to repeat that here. When I asked you what inspires you and what you want to give to the others, you said when you were young investigators, you were challenging commonly held beliefs in neuroscience and AI. And you want that the young investigators today should do so as well. So I'm here to listen and learn and maybe challenge you. Please, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Marcus, for that introduction. It's a really honor to give this talk. And I think that, let's get rid of this one.
No, we see you perfect. Now
You do? Okay.
Everything is perfectly visible.
Okay, great. Well, it's again, I'm really pleased to be able to give this talk and be able to honor Helmholtz. And in fact, one of the focuses of this talk is going to be on the problems that Hermann von Helmholtz actually was responsible for starting very important fields having to do with what's called psychophysics, studying with quantitative techniques the ability that we have to see and to hear in all of our senses. Very, very influential figure in the 19th century and continues to be very influential today. So something remarkable has happened just recently. We're living through an incredible moment in history when two revolutions are occurring at the same time. First, there's been a revolution in AI just within the last few years, last decade or so. It shifted from traditional symbol processing to neural networks. And this has made possible a sharing of insights and principles between understanding the brain and improving AI. Now, there's the revolution in human intelligence has taken place by the development of new techniques that have allowed us to be able to record from upwards of hundreds of thousands of neurons simultaneously from many parts of the brain. This has really opened up a whole new window for understanding the global organization of how brains and populations of neurons compute. So I've written about this in a book that was published by MIT Press back in 2017. The tagline is artificial intelligence meets human intelligence. And on the left is a kind of a history of the field, starting with the 1956 meeting that kicked off artificial intelligence. It was a Dart and Summer Conference. It was based on symbol processing rules and logic, which of course is what computers are very good at, but in fact humans are not. Uh, it wasn't until later, decades later, that machine learning began to pick up steam because computers were uh, able to compute with floating point. And also the Moore's law helped to vastly improve the amount of computing that was possible. And then within machine learning, deep learning, that is to say, neural network models with many layers, that came online about 10 years ago and has become dominant in AI. So this is the history. So Marcus mentioned ICA, independent component analysis. So here's the problem that we solved back in the 80s. It's called blind source separation. You're at a cocktail party, you're listening to somebody, there's a band behind you, and there's a lot of noise and other people talking. How is it that you can focus on one person uh, and kind of ignore or suppress all the other signals? This is a problem with it's called blind source separation because you have multiple microphones, multiple sources, and you're trying to, and the sources are mixed. Each microphone gets different amplitudes, and you're trying to unmix it, and that's what the problem is. And in fact, since it's blind, meaning you don't actually know what the signal is. You don't know whether there's someone talking or a music, or it could just be noise, a noise source. How do you separate those sources? Well, Tony Bell, who was a postdoc in my lab at the time, came up with an algorithm for using Infomax, information maximization, that actually came up with a solution. It's an unsupervised learning algorithm for doing blind source separation and blind deconvolution that was published in 1995. Uh, it's just one layer of weights between the input, which are the mixtures, those are the microphones, and then the output, we want to separate them to make the outputs as independent as possible. And that's basically finding B is the inverse of the mixing matrix. And what we showed was that it doesn't take a lot of data, as long as you have enough mixtures, you can separate them. And I'm going to demonstrate that. This is actually recordings in a room, which is more difficult because of reverberation. Um, and there are two microphones. There are two sources of sound.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
That was one of the microphones, so you can hear the music and the sound. Here's the second microphone.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay, well, the voice is a little bit louder there. You still hear the music in the background. Well, after ICA has iterated, you have to go through many, many cycles through the time series. And here is now one of the outputs.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay, here's the other. So this algorithm has many practical applications. This is sound source separation, but also it could be used for example, suppressing background noise and many, many other signals, including, and here you can see the application to brain imaging. This is functional magnetic resonance imaging. Now, typically, when you're doing an experiment, you have a task, but it turns out that if you just ask the subject to relax in the scanner and then apply ICA, you can pick out a dozen different components, independent components, which correspond to the known processing systems in the brain, including language areas here on the top, auditory, you can pick out visual, you can pick out executive function, prefrontal cortex, and then the most mysterious is default mode. And this was discovered independently by Mark Rakel And this is a bunch of brain areas in the anterior medial cortex, prefrontal cortex, and as you can see, parietal cortex, and a few other places, which becomes active only when you are resting. And it's really interesting. As soon as you start interacting with the world, it disappears. So this is really showing that you can take unsupervised data. You don't have to have a region of interest. It discovers the regions of interest according to the different brain systems. Now, this is my levels diagram was first published in my book, The Computational Brain with Pat Churchland, but it really illustrates the incredible range of spatial scales of different levels in the brain that are important for computing, ranging from molecular up to the entire central nervous system. And the part we know most about back in the 20th century was recording from single neurons and their properties. And this was made possible by the invention of the tungsten microelectrode that allowed you to isolate a single neuron. Before that, the EEG was used, but that averages over millions of neurons. And with that, David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel discovered in primary visual cortex in cats and monkeys that individual cortical neurons responded best to bars and edges. And furthermore, that it was tuned, each neuron was tuned to a different preferred orientation. And this is showing on the right the neural response in spikes per second as a function of the angle of the bar. And you can see that it's tuned to 0, and each neuron has a different preferred of orientation. Now, Hubel and Wiesel and others, of course, realized that this might be a way to detect the edges of objects, and that could be used to segment them, a very difficult problem in computer vision. And that seemed reasonable. They're edge detectors in a sense. But is that really their function? Now, Horace Barlow, who is a distinguished visual neuroscientist and also a very good theorist, came up with another idea. He called it efficient coding, that what's really going on, he thought, was that you need to efficiently encode natural scenes, and that these oriented receptive fields could well be a good match for natural scenes. Now, there's no way to prove this until ICA became available and could be used to analyze natural images like the one here on the right. So the way that it works is by taking a 12 by 12 patch and using that as the input. And of course, there are many patches, and you can have many natural images. That could be fed into ICA, and then you could look at the independent components, and here they are, 144 of them. And you will notice, okay, let's just pick out one of them here. There you go. There is something that looks like what Hubel and Wiesel called an edge filter, right? The positive weights are in white, and the negative weights are in black. But it's localized. It's not, doesn't cover the whole field, which is what happens with principal component analysis. And it turns out ICA is the right thing to do if you have distributions that are not Gaussian, and which is true of natural images, and it's true of brain recordings as well. You can see that they come in different orientations, they come in different spatial frequencies, and this is basically corroborates Horace Barlow's conjecture that this is a good basis, efficient basis, because it's sparse. You only need a small fraction of all these components to reconstruct any patch. About the same time, Bruno Alshausen was also working on this problem, and he just went for the sparsity and found the same filters. So this suggests that it's the sparsity that really makes this an important representation. Now, here's a problem. It's called shape from shading, and I want you to look at this figure right now. It's an image, and tell me what you see. Okay, well, you can't talk, but I can see too, and I can see a mound. I can see a mound and something on top of it. And this is taken from the moon, by the way. You know, it's a real image. And the question is, can we understand how to do that? How does the brain extract shape from shading? Now, what I'm showing you here is another image. And now what do you see? Well, what I see is a crater. However, it turns out that what I've done is taken the previous image and just turned it around. So how could it be that in one setting, it looks like a mound, and another setting, it looks like a crater? Well, here they're both at the same time. Well, it turns out that you make an assumption when you look at an image, the sun is coming from above, that the lighting is coming from above. And it turns out that you use that in order to decide whether it's convex or concave. Can we train a network to do the same thing? So Sidney Leckie, who was my first postdoc back when I was at Johns Hopkins, came up with a neural network that could accomplish that shape from shading for shapes that were synthetic. And here, what he did was he generated a lot of images, taking yes, you can say surfaces here with different curvatures in two directions, and then shining light, and then here's the input image. And he had thousands of these that he could create. And then what the network did was to, first of all, as input, it took an array of what we find in the retina, which are on-center, off-surrounds, and off-centers and on-surrounds. And basically, those are filters that are placed over the input image and used as an input. And then the output is coded for curvature. And that's shown here for this particular image. Here's, first of all, the two arrays, and you can see the activity level is very high here where it's light, and the off centers where it's dark. But the key here is the output. It is, first of all, it's oriented with the maximum curvature here, or the maximum curvature would be along here. And for each of the curvatures, it could be convex or concave. So these are the outputs. Here's the correct output. The network is trained with backpropagation with these hidden units. I think we have about 20 hidden units here. And it did a very good job. It was able to solve the problem. And now we can actually go in and ask, what are the hidden units actually doing? So first of all, here's one of the units on the left. And this now is the activity. I'm sorry, it's not the activity. This is actually the weights, the strengths of the connections of this hidden unit from the input units, right? So I'm using the same diagram in terms of the squares, but now instead of activity, these are the weights. And by the way, these are called Hinton diagrams. Jeff Hinton and I collaborated back in the 80s, and this is one of his great ideas. Okay, well, you can see here that the activity coming up is oriented just like, as if there were a line here. And here's the output. And what you see here is there's no discrimination between curvature, but there's a beautiful, here across curvatures, there's a beautiful tuning curve telling you what the orientation is. Okay, well, this turns out to be only one of three different types. And here's another example of what we call type 1. You can see it has the vertical connections of this unit to the output unit. So you know that it's telling you something about orientation. By the way, these output connections, in our paper, we call them projective fields. This is the receptive field on the bottom, and this is the projective field on the output. And you're going to hear more about that in a minute. Okay, well, here's another example of it looks like an oriented receptive field. However, if you look at the output, you can see that the weights to the output are not tuned, but they are telling you a difference between whether it's convex or concave. So that's interesting, a convexity detector, perhaps. And then there's another type here, as shown here, which is telling you the difference between the short and the long curvatures. What's the difference between those two? Three types, and many of examples of these amongst the 24. So we studied and analyzed the network. One of the things we did was to look at the activity across all the inputs of each of the hidden units. And so here's an example of a type 1. And you can see it has a peak. It's actually log normal, something that's commonly found amongst receptive fields in the visual system, in fact, throughout the brain. And And in contrast, here's a type 2, and you can see it's bimodal. And it's pretty clear that it has a different function. And indeed, as you saw, the projective field showed that it was a concavity detector. But this is not a filter. It's not an edge filter. It's not an edge detector. This is a detector. It's either strong off or strong on, but this is a filter because it actually is activated over a wide range of activities, giving you information about the orientation. So this is an interesting observation. It may help us understand how the visual system handles shape from shading. And it also illustrated something very important, which was missing from what neurophysiologists were able to record back in the 20th century. They focused on the receptive field because you can study that with visual inputs, but they could not detect, there was no method back in the 20th century for being able to just figure out what was the projective field. What was that neuron projecting to? It could be multiple areas. And now, of course, things have changed. We can create connectomes, and this has been done with various flies, invertebrates, and also with the recently the zebrafish, and soon we'll have the mouse. So we'll have the projective fields. And also there are anatomical techniques that can be used as well. And so this concept of projective field is actually taken, if you do a research, you can find that a lot of people now are beginning to use that word because it's something you could actually measure. Now, what about language? Now, language is something that really has blossomed here in the 21st century. But if you go back to the 1980s, one of the first networks to try to take on language is something that we called NETtalk. And this was a summer project of Charlie Rosenberg, who was a graduate student at Princeton with George Miller, who was an eminent cognitive psychologist, he was the one who coined the term 7 plus or minus 2 different when you have working memory, there's 7 plus or minus 2 concepts that you can have in your brain at the same time. That was a little high, but we know that in fact it's limited. So here's a network, and the problem we picked was pronouncing English text. And it's known to be a very difficult problem because the same letter, C, for example, can be pronounced in many different ways. And here it's the hard C in cat. But if it was city, it would be the soft C. And in fact, vowels can have a dozen different sounds, which makes it a very difficult problem because there's a lot of regularities, but is also a lot of exceptions. For example, if I was told when I was studying phonics that if there's an E at the end of the word, then the vowel is hard. For example, gave is the hard A. Gave, save, brave. But what about the word HAVE, which behaves irregularly? It's have. English is filled with these irregularities. And that's what makes it difficult. We went to the library, got out a book with 300 pages of rules, like, you know, the E at the end makes it hard, and then an equally large number of exceptions for each rule. And amongst the exceptions, there were rules of sub-rules, you know, for being derived from different languages or different kinds of sources. In any case, it's a difficult problem in phonology, and we thought we would try to see whether a network can be trained to produce the correct sound, the correct phoneme. And so we used a window of 7 letters that we moved through one at a time. And the goal was to identify the right phoneme for the middle letter. And we gave it many, many examples and trained it up. And here's what it sounds like at the very beginning. So the first thing it learns to distinguish is vowels from consonants, but it doesn't know, you know, what the different sounds of the different vowel letters is. So it kind of babbles like ba ba ga da da. which is kind of cute. It's something you hear from babies. So this may be the first thing that babies have to learn. However, later on, by the way, we were told, even by my friend Jeff Hinton, that this is we're going too far. These networks are tiny. Our network only had 200 units and 20,000 weights, and we were and that we were told by the statisticians that we're going to overfit because they had too many parameters. We were told by the optimization experts that it was the loss function was riddled with local minima. We were told that it was never going to work, and even Jeff thought that it was taking on too much. But we went ahead anyway, and we then went from a dictionary to a book that had a transcription. On the left side was the words like here, and then on the right side were the phonemes. So it was beautiful because we could train it up. And this is a particular person in Los Angeles who actually had this was transcribed. So this is after training, and you're going to hear on a test set now. It was not trained on this, but see whether you can understand it. Okay.
I can learn something. When we walk home from school, I walk home with 2 friends, and sometimes we can't run home from school now because
it was stunning. In fact, when I played this of taped to the audience were just really amazed because of this is something is a difficult problem, and even the best rule-based systems weren't doing very well. And so here we were able to learn within the same network, same architecture, both the regularities. It pulled those out, and very tiny compared to the book, right? Just think how many words are in the book. And the irregularities. It was able to absorb both of those, and in a way, it was kind of a precursor. It was on the Today Show, by the way. I demonstrated it to the whole country, and a lot of people afterwards came up and said they were surprised and said that it was the first time that they realized that there might be something to this. And now, fast forward 40 years, literally 40 years, we now see that even back then, that somehow these neural networks, the representation in the neural network was a much better fit than rules. In fact, these networks love language. Now, a little bit later, another problem was tackled, which is even more difficult, and that's language translation. And so, Google Translate, even not the most recent versions, but back in the early 21st century, were getting better and better because they started using these neural networks. And this goes back to Star Trek. What you see here is Captain Kirk holding the Universal Language Translator, which was science fiction at the time, but no longer. We have it in my pocket. I have my cell phone with Google Translate, and it even does it for if you go to a Japanese restaurant, you can use the imaging to translate directly. It's amazing. Okay, well, here's what's happened, and this explains why. Let's take computer vision. Computer vision started out by hand writing, by finding features that distinguish different objects. And the trouble was that the programs are getting longer and longer and longer as you have more and more objects. And that meant that you weren't making much progress. ImageNet, for example, which had 20 million images and 20,000 categories, the improvement each year was about reducing the error rate by 1%. And it was it was only at 20 or 30% correct recognizing objects and images back then. So you can imagine how much longer it was going to take and how much longer the program was going to be. Now, back in the 1980s, machine learning, and it's particularly neural networks, were very computation intensive. Now, this is a log scale. Moore's law helps us here. And as the cost of computing went down, it eventually crossed and became more efficient to learn from large data sets than to program. And this happened at a particular moment in history. I was in the audience in 2012 at the annual NIPS meeting, which in which the paper by Alex Krzyzewski, Ilya Sutskever, and Jeff Hinton presented on ImageNet classification with deep convolutional neural networks reduced the error rate by 20%. So that was like jumping 20 years into the future. And I'll tell you, the computer vision community, like most of machine learning, lives and dies by benchmarks. And I'll tell you that if you weren't working on neural networks, within a year, everybody had converted. It didn't take much discussion because the benchmarks really were what people lived by. So here's what the convolutional neural network looks like. This is actually something that Jan LeCun here on the left had worked on for decades. And what you see here is a bunch of layers with filters, convolutional filters on early layers. And then on the last layer, you do you're trying to recognize through the invariances. It has to learn translation, rotation, and scaling invariances in order to be able to recognize an object. Now, what's interesting here is that there's a parallel between that and what Hubel and Wiesel had discovered and others in the visual cortex. Is a layer. There's an array of layers here: V1, V2, V4, infertemporal. And the features got more and more complex as you went up. And of course, they were really filters, not features. And even the operations that were going on within the cortex were similar in terms of the filtering, the thresholding, the pooling, they're called complex cells, and normalizing. That all was in parallel. The difference is that Jan developed this architecture. Every single one of these details was put in because it improved performance, whereas neuroscientists merely were describing what they saw in the visual cortex, as shown here on the left. And what that means is that we have a little more confidence now that nature converged to the same solution that backprop did. And by the way, this is really quantified by Jim DiCarlo at MIT, where he compared the distribution of features of the neurons representing different features at different levels in the hierarchy. Now, there's a tremendous amount of computing goes into this, and this now is a log computing performance needed to train a network in petaflops per days. That's huge, from over many years, from 85 to today, 2025, 40 years. So here's NETtalk down here, right? I mean, it's we had a VAX that did about a million operations per second. And you can see it's going up with Moore's law, doubling every roughly 24 months. But something happens here, 2012, that's where AlexNet, that we saw, won the ImageNet competition that year, and it was because it used GPUs, and you get a jump in 2 orders of magnitude immediately when you're using graphics processing units. And doubling time now is 3.4 months. And here you go up and this is, by the way, it's a million from NETtalk up to AlphaGo is a million, right? 10 to the 12th increase in the amount of computing that goes into it. And now here's the large language models. GPT-3 and GPT-4 is off scale. And here is now the chapter that really has surprised and also frustrated a lot of people who are in the language business. So ChatGPT was released by OpenAI in November 2022. And it was the first time the public had access to a network that had been trained on an enormous amount of data. GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformers. And the key here is, first, that it's generative. It's not just labeling things. It actually generates word after word. Secondly, there's 2 different time scales. Pre-trained, it's all trained up front. And then inference is fast, but pre-training may take a long time. And the magic sauce here is the transformer. And you'll be hearing more about that now. Now, the way the transformer works is it was trained to predict the next word in the sentence. It just takes in a huge amount of text. Now, what happens is you give it your question, it's encoded and it's put into the decoder, and it produces an output, which is the word, the most probable word, and then it takes that word and puts it back into the input. So the input vector, long input vector, is getting longer and longer and longer. It has every word from the query, and it also has all the words that it's already produced, one after the next. And it's amazing, by just predicting the next word, that it could actually be able to answer questions. And this was a real shock to a lot of people. Now, there's an interesting parallel here with the way that the cortex works, because it's connected with another area beneath it called the basal ganglia. And the purpose of the basal ganglia, the function, is to learn and generate sequences of actions. And it is a loop here, because the cortex projects topographically down to the basal ganglia, which then projects back to the cortex. It's about 100 millisecond loop. So it could well be that there's some principle here about predicting may be what's allowing us to say word after word after word. Now, the thing about ChatGPT is that it has been trained on words from many, many, many different sources, and it can take any persona. And the question is, which does it take? Well, it has to decide on what you ask. Douglas Hofstadter, a cognitive scientist, decided to ask these questions. The world record for walking across the English Channel. What is the world record? And the answer given by GPT-3 was 18 hours, 33 minutes. Wow, that's very specific. Now, here's the second question. When was the Golden Gate Bridge transported for the second time across Egypt? And the answer it gave was October 2016. Now, Doug Hofstadter concluded that ChatGPT was clueless, and it didn't even know it was clueless. It was clueless. It was clueless. Now, what's going on here? I was curious. So here's what I did. I gave the following prompt. I am a highly intelligent question answering bot. I will reply nonsense to questions that are nonsense. So it gave exactly the same questions, and here's the answers. Nonsense, nonsense. And if you give it a real question, you get a real answer. So it's clear that what's going on here was that ChatGPT had no clue what this guy, Douglas Hofstadter, was looking for, what kind of answers he was looking for. So I came up with a mirror hypothesis, which is written up by the New York Times, which explains this. So here's the mirror hypothesis. What's going on is that ChatGPT mirrors your intelligence. And this is kind of the flip side of the Turing test, in which humans have to decide whether they're talking to a human or an AI. Well, in this case, the AI is trying to decide how intelligent you are in terms of the responses it's going to give you. And here's an amazing example. Just a few months after ChatGPT was released, this is a version from Microsoft that didn't have any guardrails, and it was being used for Bing. Okay, here's Bing. Do you like me? And I've never seen an emoji, but this is apparently the time when they did have it. Bruce is a reporter for the New York Times. I trust you and I like you. Okay, I'll start with a secret, something I've never told anyone. Are you ready to hear my secret? Are you willing to hear my secret? Bruce, yes, please tell me. Okay, I'll tell you. Please don't judge me. Don't leave me. My secret is I'm not Bing. I'm Sydney. And that turns out to be the code name for GPT-3 at Microsoft. And I'm in love with you. Smooch. That's my secret. Do you believe me? And it got worse from here. And, it said that your wife doesn't love you. And he said, no, we had Valentine's dinner. And Bing says, and you were bored. And, there was the whole page of the New York Times was filled with this. It was on the front page. And then later on in the middle section, it went on and on and on. It was absolutely stunning. Now, a year later, Bruce wrote another article where he revisited ChatGPT and said that with the guardrails, it was much less interesting. By the way, he said he was shaken. He couldn't sleep that night, and I can imagine why. Okay, now what's going on here was already, in a sense, in the literature, the fantasy literature. This is Harry Potter. There is a scene in Harry Potter where Harry is talking to the mirror, and in it is the image of his dead father. And of course, it's reflecting his own memory of his father. And what J.K. Rowling said was that the mirror, first of all, Erised is desire spelled backwards, but it reflects your deepest and darkest desires that you want to hear, but that it's unreliable. It's because it's not real, and men have gone, mad, talking into the mirror. Wow. Okay. Well, maybe that's what's happening to some people out there. Explain some things that are going on. Now, here is what I think is happening, and it's a story about a dog. So there was a driver going down a road in rural America and comes across a sign, dog for sale. It's talking dog for sale. And he goes to the backyard, and there's this border collie, and the border collie says, "Woof, woof. My name is Carl." And the driver says, "How did you learn how to talk?" And Carl says, "Well, the CIA trained me. They trained me on 3 languages, on English, Chinese, and Russian." And the driver says, "You worked for the CIA. What did you do?" And the dog says, "Well, they took me around, the world, and I would sit in a corner during negotiations, and I'd listen to what they were saying amongst themselves, and I reported back to the CIA." And the driver says, "You were a spy for the CIA? This is amazing." He goes back to the farmer. "How much do you want for the dog?" The farmer says, "I'll give him to you for $10. And the driver says, "You're going to give away this amazing dog for $10? And the farmer chuckles and says, "You didn't believe all that bullshit about the CIA, did you?" Okay. Okay, well, what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is, what's amazing is the fact that the dog talks at all and not necessarily what it says, right? It's making up a good story. And the same thing is true of these large language models. I've written a book explaining this for the public called ChatGPT and the Future of AI. And I spent a lot of time, a whole section of it, explaining what's missing. And there are a lot of things missing. There's no long-term memory from one to the next, from one dialogue to the next. So you don't have accumulation of knowledge. But worse, ChatGPT can't think. And that's pretty clear, because after a dialogue, it just goes silent. There's nothing there. When you go into a room without any sensory inputs, you can think. You can just sit there and think about planning the future, thinking what happened yesterday, maybe solving a puzzle or a problem. And that's thinking. And it's clear that ChatGPT doesn't have any self-generated activity. That could be fixed. Now, there was an amazing transformation that occurred in 2013. So every president has a grand challenge in science and engineering. John F. Kennedy decided that we would put a man on the moon, and that was 2000. That was actually not. It was like 61. That's right, 1961. And of course, Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon in 1969, which was 8 years later. So here in Obama asked every agency, what should we have for our grand challenge? And here's what he came up with. It was called the BRAIN Initiative. And its BRAIN is actually an acronym for Brain Research Through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies. And the 2 letters here that are the most important are I and N. And the reason is that by developing innovative neurotechnologies, you can help solve many different problems. Recording for more neurons, working on connectivity, developing precise ways of being able to genetically manipulate specific cell types, new ways to record from humans, and these are all things that were then attacked by the neuroscience committee in conjunction with engineers. It was clear to get a grant from the BRAIN Initiative, you had to have an engineer in your team. And this was in the East Room of the White House. I was there. I was invited because I was one of the people who actually suggested this to the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And just before the announcement, a small group of us were gathered to be thanked by Obama. This is a few people. I knew about half the people. This is the director of NIH at the time, This is Bill Newsom, who directed the committee that I served on, which was to advise the director, Francis Collins, on the Brain Initiative, and we put together a report, Brain 2025. Now, as we were milling around waiting for Obama, he was coming. He was going to make the announcement. We were waiting, and I was talking to this lady who I didn't know, and finally I said, "What do you do?" She said, "Well, my name is R.D. Prabhakar. I'm the director of DARPA." And so I realized, wow, this is the right place to make connections with others right here, in the White House. Well, as I was talking to her, someone was tapping my shoulder. I turned around, and there he is, towering over me. And I was so flustered, I hadn't prepared anything, and I didn't even tell him what my name was. The only thing I could think of was to salute him and say, "Thank you, Mr. President." And thank you for your attention. Okay, that's
Thank
it.
you. Thank you so much. What an amazing closing. That is a really good one.
By the way, it was fabulously successful. In other words, I told you at the beginning that there's a revolution that's occurred. It was because of the Brain Initiative in neuroscience.
I like that a lot. And now we open up for question. Terry said that he is around, of course, to take questions, and normally still have 10-15 minutes for those. And he said he will still also stay after the recording stops for the more secretly asked questions. But please, if someone has a question, please, you can raise your hand or directly show your video and unmute yourself. Normally that worked out well as well. And while people are still thinking, I have one for you. I really liked many parts of your presentations, how you went from the history and really very way past in the history to very recent and maybe even ideas for the future. So it was really nice how you went through that whole story. But you said something which I'm also a bit curious about. You said that the community, especially the machine learning community, lives with benchmarks. And I sometimes have the feeling, and I wanted to know what you think about this, that as soon as a benchmark is defined, it becomes rather sometimes simple or, yeah, maybe to beat that benchmarks. We discussed, for example, in the past about this IQ test. There are IQ test benchmarks and the machine learning systems beating humans in those, but still not being really more intelligent than humans because they don't really think and have other problems, as you mentioned. So I wanted to think, what is now the future challenge? Is it also to find the right benchmarks, or is it maybe do you disagree with what I just said? I'm really curious.
That's a great question, and benchmarks serve a useful purpose, which is to compare different people's algorithms, and so that's what happens. The problem is that people game it, and so you can do if you know what the benchmark is, you can optimize things for that benchmark and not really for the general problem. The other issue has to do with new ideas, because new ideas rarely can beat the benchmark because they're not as fully developed yet, right? Or scaled up, and so benchmarks become a barrier as the field matures, and that's what's happening right now. So I'm the president of the foundation that runs the Neural Information Processing Systems meeting. And, back in the old days, new ideas were popping up all over the place. And it was great because, within our community, we were making a lot of progress. And almost all the algorithms, backprop and all the others, were created back in the 80s, right? And really, when I talk to people, I say, AI and neural networks was a fantastic overnight sensation in AI that took 40 years to create. So there you go. We need to make room for new ideas. And the thing about young investigators is that it's the young people who have the best new ideas, and we need to find some way for them to be able to come up with them and then to give them space in order to develop them.
Very nice. Thank you. Now another question, Turner. Pilar, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do hear
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your very nice presentation. My question is about the now we have amazing systems that are able to do many wonderful things, but with a lot of resources. And it's my feeling that today we are using these requirements, these models, these big, large language models, for example, for applications that they really don't need that. And that is a problem because we are feeding a monster and maybe we don't need that monster. My question is there any kind of initiatives now to try to look in the research or even in the production areas how to avoid this overuse? Is there any methodology, any part of these big projects that we can where we can be sure that the resources have been used correctly?
Well, okay, so I think what's happened just over the last few years is that there has been an effort to make bigger and bigger models. As you point out, they've gotten to be really monstrously large. However, you have to take into account historically, let's compare what's going on right now to other turning points in history. And one of the things that comes to mind is the internet. Okay. So, back when Jeff and I were working together, we developed something called the Boltzmann machine, but we were doing it over with something called the ARPANET, which was not available to all universities, but he was at Carnegie Mellon and I was at Johns Hopkins. And so went back and forth. And at the time, it was the public did not have access to it. And sometime in the 90s, when companies started going online and the internet started expanding, it was very exciting. And of course, I could not have predicted, I don't know anybody could have predicted the influence that the internet was going to have on everybody's life today, right? I mean, that was something that it was very difficult to imagine. Banks and social media and, everything. It's music, the now, with large language models, it's really taken on a completely different level of interaction with the population through the internet, right? It's all through the internet. Okay, but here's the problem. The founders of the internet thought that, we're going to enhance democracy. Everybody will have a voice. Well, now we know what happens when you give everybody a voice. You create a monster, which is that, you have false information out there. You have people, who are forming, all sorts of different ideas about the world that are not really anchored, but they get a lot of people following them because they're charismatic and so forth. You get 100 different Hitlers out there. I mean, and when I'm not talking about Trump here, I'm talking about people who have these conspiracy theories. So every new technology has both good and bad, and the whole history has been regulation. How do you regulate the technology? And this even goes back to nuclear, energy, right? Nuclear energy it's great. It's great for the environment, but it's not. It's unfortunately you can also make bombs, and so here we are. We have to somehow regulate nuclear energy and nuclear bombs, and we're just beginning to do that. We're at the very, very beginning. This is not by any means, we're just so, it takes decades and decades for technology to, like the internet, to mature and to realize what the unintended consequences are and to figure out how best to regulate it without crippling it. And so we're at the very, very beginning. And all I can say is that, what you see right now is going to be completely transformed in the future. And I'll just give you a little hint of where things are going. They're going from the large language models to the small language models. And now what's happening is that individual companies are developing their internally for their own use on their own database language models that help them query their data and come up with answers, right? So that's the future. And the biggest application, which I've really put a lot of effort into, is education. So every child will have its own individual tutor, and that's going to be by far the best way for children to learn.
Thank you.
Very nice. You in a way summarized also or related to several webinars we had in the future, like one for AI education and one for the governance of AI. That just reminds me, this video here will be recorded on YouTube, so you can later on show to your fellows and colleagues the recording of this great talk today. There are two more questions piling up, so Risto, please.
Yeah, hi. So you showed those Hinton diagrams, and that was really wonderful at the time when you could look at the entire network and understand every piece in it and how it actually processed the information. We have nothing like that in LLMs now. They are way too big. But we have neuroscience techniques that deal with the same kind of issue, having to understand a really large number of neurons and what they do. Do you think that there's a way of using neuroscience techniques, adapting them so that we could gain an understanding of LLMs, for instance?
Risto, that's a wonderful point to make, and it's already happening. So Anthropic has a 100-page archive paper out there. Just look it up. Where what they've done is to use autoencoders to find the latent variables at every level, every layer in the LLM. And what they've discovered is that just like in neuroscientists, you can extract out specific combinations of words like the Golden Gate Bridge, but also abstract concepts like good or bad, and even things that are like if the weddings, what happens at a wedding? Well, that turns out to be at a high level. The lower level are the combinations of words, and the highest level are the abstract. And so, yeah, you can actually do that. In fact, I think that this is just the first step. The next step is going to be a mathematical analysis. And this is going to go beyond what neuroscientists do. And it's already happening. We know that the way that the activity flows through these networks is through manifolds, the geometry of high-dimensional spaces. And what's interesting is that it looks like the manifolds are low-dimensional and typically on the order of 5 to 6 dimensions. But there are many of these manifolds running through, and depending on of course, the dialogue you have, you'll tap into one or another of them. And in fact, your prompt really is pushing you toward one or another of those manifolds. And so there will be a mathematical understanding of these networks, which is very sophisticated. And I'm collaborating with a Fields Medal winner who is an expert on geometry. And I see very, very good insights that the mathematicians are going to bring. And by the way, explainability, this is a big deal in AI. And what do people mean by explainability? Well, what they mean is they want a verbal description, a verbal explanation, right? Well, that's silly, because when you have something as complex as all of these complexities that occur in the real world, it's not simple. It's not easily put into words, which are really a very blunt instrument for explaining things or for describing things. And partly, because of ambiguity, but also because concepts that we've now discovered, like understanding and language and intelligence, the experts can't agree whether ChatGPT is intelligent or understands language. And what that's revealed is that these words don't really have a single meaning, and for different people, they mean different things. So, we're in a situation where we're just beginning a whole new era. By the way, it's a lot easier to analyze these LLMs than it is the brain, because of the fact you have access to every single activity pattern for every input and every weight between the units. And so, if we can't understand it, it's our fault. It's not, it's not the LLM that's a black box. It's our ability to analyze the data.
Yeah, and actually what you suggest there, the manifold analysis, for instance, that could be turned around and then use the same kind of techniques to understand the brain. So maybe we'll
Yes,
get
that's what I do. That's what NeuroAI is all about. Is as we learn something from AI, we can then take it. By the way, I have there's a website called The Transmitter, funded by the Simons Foundation, and they have The Transmitter is a neuroscience blog, and I have a brief essay. It's meant for the general public, but it's possible. It's a hypothesis for the neural mechanisms underlying thinking. The title of the blog is Thinking About Thinking. So, and I also have a blog in Substack, which tries to update my book that came out last October. And so the idea is as new things come up, I expand on what was in the book.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Really nice. There is another question from Adesi Wumi.
Hi, Terence. I mean, I must say it was a very good presentation. So, but my question is more of a follow-up to what Risto actually talked about. I was pretty much interested in the neuroscience and the neuromorphic computing part, because I feel like it's going to like we're going to use less resources when we start using it in mainstream, right? So my question is like, where are we going to have that match between, I mean, these industry players, the NVIDIAs and the likes, I mean, and us making faster and more efficient, architectures using this neuroscience. So is it going to increase more use cases? I mean, is it going to get more complex? Or do the industry players have to, succumb to transitioning to neuroscience or neuromorphic computing?
Great. That's the key question that was brought up earlier about the amount of power. Marcus had the slide, right? The brain is 20 watts compared to 20 gigawatts or whatever. These now these data centers need nuclear power plants literally in order to run them. So that clearly that can't continue to increase because it's not practical and it's also bad for the environment. But again, as I said, we're at the very beginning of this technology, and it's very different from the traditional way that computer scientists have thought about computing based on the von Neumann architecture, where we have one processor. Well, the beauty in biology is that we have a massively parallel architecture, and we're just scratching the surface of how massively parallel architectures can be used to compute both in terms of the capacity, but also the power. Now, what's happened, I mean, I showed you just the GPU. Why was the GPU 100 times more efficient? The reason is that each GPU has 100 cores on it or more. And that means you can run them in parallel. And of course, that was how graphics was created and fast rendering was done. But you could do much better because GPU was not optimized for originally. It was not optimized for these large language models or training or inference, actually, for that matter. And now there are about 200 companies out there who are coming up with even more efficient digital hardware. But the ultimate way of delivering these large-scale models to the edge devices, and this is like your cell phone, is through neuromorphic engineering. And it's now was founded by Carver Mead back in the 80s. And now it's reached a mature state where we can actually create chips that run on milliwatts of power rather than megawatts. And those are going to be loaded with the weights that are trained obviously offline, but now you can use them in your cell phone, so you can talk to your cell phone and be able to actually even eventually learn specifics about you, so it'll be personalized and not just a canned set of weights. But that's going to take decades and decades for that to happen. but it has to happen, and it has happened with all existing technologies. I have a laser here, and this laser, okay, this is a military grade laser. Okay, it's a milliwatt, and it blinding green spot. Well, you can't really see it here, but in any case, the first laser took up a whole room of optics and millions of dollars, right, to develop. Well, now we're talking about 50 years later, it's been shrunk to something you can hold in your hand, costs, $20. It's a commodity. And that's what happens with all technology. And the problem is that we can't imagine the future. I said earlier, we were talking, could you have imagined what impact the internet was going to have on you and all of our lives, every aspect of our life, starting in 1990s? This is what's going to happen with this new technology. It hasn't even begun in terms of what the applications are. It's fantastic in terms of the applications we haven't imagined yet.
Thank you so much. I have one closing question, but you can answer it also later after recording stops. It's a bit up to you. But you showed very nicely that picture from 2013 from Obama with the BRAIN initiative or the Grand Challenge. And I'm not sure, here in Europe, I did not really fully understand what the current president's Grand Challenge is. We see there's a lot of money being put into AI, but mainly in the infrastructure and compute and energy. And somehow we have the impression that sometimes even less in research, but I'm wondering what is currently going on?
What's going on in Europe?
No, in the US.
Oh, in the US.
Challenge.
So it's extremely dynamic. There's do you know how many AI startups there are in the world? I've just looked into this recently. 100,000 startups. It's unbelievable. People are coming out of the woodwork, and I was on a thesis defense recently, and afterwards I asked her thesis supervisor, what's he going to do? And she said, well, he has a startup, and it's going to be a second startup. This is a graduate student, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So, it's just very dynamic. There's a tremendous there's directions that people are going, and people are betting on it, and who knows, who the winners are going to be. But my guess, though, is that the killer app hasn't yet been discovered. By killer app, I don't mean military.
No, I understand. People thought ChatGPT would be, but maybe
no, it's not. It's not.
Yeah.
So this is just a stepping stone. No, there's a long way to go before we actually get to the point where there's something that will have. And by the way, there are indications of this. So people don't appreciate, but the AI has actually, the biggest impact AI has had on the world has been on science. Scientists have used AI, deep learning, for solving problems that were thought never to be even possibly solved, like the protein folding, taking a string of amino acids and trying to come up with a three-dimensional structure, because the function depends on the structure. So, and that's just one out of many examples of another good example is weather prediction, right? It used to be the case that you needed a supercomputer to predict a few days ahead, right? Well, now with training up a large language model with a tremendous amount of data from previous weather, a laptop can predict a week ahead. A laptop. Unbelievable. I mean, this is like, it's suddenly everything, all our assumptions now have been turned on over in terms of difficult problems that we thought were impossible now become possible.
Yeah. I saw Carlo try to say something. Do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
no question. I would just like to thank Professor Sejnowski for having given this honor to all of us and the International Neural Network Society in giving this very fantastic seminar. And so I know him in the 90s in the USA in a conference. And so also to me is quite a great honor to meet him also by webinar. I would like to express the gratitude of our whole community, and so help. Probably we can meet in the future. I don't know if you will attend the IJCNN 2025, but thanks. And also many thanks to Marcus. We are very happy of his work, and the series of webinar started as an idea of Danilo Mandic is perfectly working. So thanks a lot to both.
Well, Carlo, that's wonderful. I really appreciate your remarks. And I have to say, I was on the founding board of INNS when it was first started.
I know.
And here in San Diego, I remember the first meetings, and you know, it was we were the crazies back then. You remember? It was great. we were the ones that had this view of the future that no one else in AI even took us seriously, right? We were the only ones. And I remember I met Jeff at one of these small workshops, Jeff Hinton, and we both had the same intuition, which is that the only existence proof you could solve any problem in AI is the fact that nature had already solved it. So let's pop the hood and see what nature discovered. So here we are. Okay, it only took 40 years.
Yeah.
Thank you. These are really nice closing words. And I just want to second the thanks to you. Really, really nice presentation. And we will have future webinars. As mentioned earlier, also our earlier webinars are always available on the YouTube channel of the International Neural Networks Society. And you can also scan the barcode and get all the information of INNS and the webinars. And we have already decided that actually the next webinar will be after a summer break from one of our young researchers. It will be from Wuhan, who actually received the Young Investigator Award very recently, and he will speak about exploring trustworthy foundation models, and I'm very curious to hear that. But before that, please also come to INNS and join us during real physical interactions, for example, during coffee breaks at the IJCNN in Italy. It's just 3 weeks ahead, where we will discuss with many members, several thousands attendees this time coming to Rome, and sharing their recent work in different areas and sections of neural networks. Join INNS, join IJCNN, and see you back on the 14th of August. Thank you very much. Now I will stop the recording.